Do you tend to be a kind person that's always serving others? Have you experienced a religiously destructive relationship or an emotionally destructive relationship? Hi, I'm Tara. I've been there too. And this podcast is all about us living brighter and ever growing 1% at a time. Have you ever tried to set a boundary and you felt so guilty that you actually took that boundary back? Or have you ever said yes to something when you really wanted to say no, but you felt way too guilty to do that? You're not alone. Guilt is a big part of a kind girl's life and can really be used to manipulate us and have a false guilt and really be choking. And so let's talk about guilt in our life. So where do we get this guilt, this overarching sense of guilt? Well, first of all, we have to remember that as kids, we're basically in an environment where we just cope with the environment we have. And so we get wired in certain ways. And so we can look back at our environment, the way we were raised, and to see how guilt was used in that environment. For example, if any of us grew up in a really religious household where guilt was used to manipulate and keep us on the straight and narrow, then it is probably very easy for us to have a bigger sense of guilt. My husband comes from a Catholic background, and that was the type of Catholic background he came from, where they use guilt to really keep people in line. And you just kind of get that wired in where there's just a lot more guilt than people that haven't grown up in that environment. It also comes from when we're kids and we express some of our wants and desires, and then we're made to feel like that's not okay. And I did this to my kids in this example I'm going to give you. Like, have you ever had or ever seen a situation where, like, you go visit the relatives, or in this case, I went to visit great-grandma-in-law, and great-grandma with her mushy lips just couldn't wait to kiss the grandchildren. And I have one daughter that definitely has a tendency to have like a stronger, like, no, I don't want that. And she was only like, just a little person at that time. And she did not want to kiss grandma with those big lips. And I don't blame her. But at that point, where I was at in my life and in my journey, I was like, no, give grandma a kiss. We don't want to make great grandma feel bad. She's old. So I basically manipulated my daughter into doing something she didn't want to do and kiss those squishy lips. And that's a great way to program my kids to undermine their own desires and feel guilty and be guilted into that. And, I had that a lot in my growing up too, and how guilt was used if I wanted to express like my own needs and wants and individuality to a degree. So it's interesting, like we can look back at our past, for example, like when we wanted to maybe not share a toy. How did that work for us in our family system? Was that like, oh, you're always being selfish? And obviously we want to train our children to share and stuff like that. And it's also good to train our children that they can have their own wants and desires and needs as well. Another thing, I had a daughter, actually it's the same daughter. She was very particular on taste and very particular on textures. And so, just being like, okay, we got to get her conformed and get her to eat healthy and get her that. And honestly, the funny thing is ever since she was about 1 until now, and she's 18, her texture sensitivity is just there. It doesn't matter. It's just there. And so it's just very interesting how that's played out in our lives and our family system. So if you were like maybe growing up, possibly not allowed to have like, hey, I want time alone, or I want a boundary of keeping the door shut for a little bit, or I want a boundary on my space. And if that wasn't allowed, or you felt guilted into being like, hey, you're being selfish, that's not okay, you always have to share, things like that, it can kind of just get wired in us that we don't get to make room for our wants and desires and needs if it's different than the adults around us and what they want, desire, and need for us. So also we can have an oversense of guilt if we grew up in an environment where there was constant criticism or demeaning, because as children, no matter what goes on, whether it's like parents have perfectionism, OCD, alcohol issues, a divorce, whatever it is, unfortunately, as children, we just assume it's our fault. It's like the way we're wired, because I think it's too much for our little brains to think that our adult caregivers aren't the best caregivers. Like that, our brains, little brains, cannot fathom that. And so we automatically just put this guilt and be like, hey, it's our job, it's because of us. And so that can like adopt a belief system that of guilt. So it's very interesting. So a lot of these false guilt, being manipulated by guilt, comes from our belief system that we've adopted. And we don't even know that we have adopted this. For example, like it's selfish to have your own wants, needs, and desires and to express them and make room for that in the world. And so if that's been taught to you and you believe that, then you're going to feel guilty when we try to like make room for ourselves in the world. And that was definitely my belief system, that I was there to serve others. And even when I was tired, exhausted, burnt out, I was still there to serve others. And that was my job. And you could always do more to help others. So about 3 months ago, I noticed like just an overriding sense of guilt. And I'm pretty familiar with how guilt is like used to manipulate me, and I use it on myself to manipulate me. So it was very interesting as a overall arching sense of guilt creeped into my life. And what it had to do with, it was very interesting, is I had a friend that asked me to do something I didn't want to do. And rather than say, I don't really feel comfortable with that and I don't want to do that, I procrastinated for, oh my goodness, I think about 2 months. And then I just felt guilty, more and more guilty, and it was not good. It was not helpful. And I think I felt like I was being mean by denying my friend what she wanted, but I didn't want to do it and I didn't feel good about it. So it was not something I should have done, and I just guilted myself into feeling guilty and not doing anything, which did not serve me in the end. And so I just started getting this overriding sense of guilt. Well, I did talk to my friend and told her I just don't feel comfortable with that. And she hasn't talked to me since. And I think I knew that, but that was okay, because we've had a very friendship that's been very unbalanced for many years. And really friendships need to be healthy and balanced and things like that, and give and take on both ends. And sometimes friendships change, and that's okay too. But it was very interesting that my procrastination and my desire to not do a hard thing and feeling guilty and like a mean person or unkind really affected me overarching. And it really helped because I saw a life coach, and because I am a life coach and hypnotherapist, I see a life coach and a hypnotherapist because I really believe in the power of other people being able to see things that I can't see. And the life coach really pointed out, she's like, if you have the thought that by doing this you're hurting her, or that it's unkind, you are not going to want to, you're going to feel guilty, and you're not going to want to do that because you're a very nice person. And so I really had to work with my thinking as far as to process through that. And that was great to have a life coach help me to do that. So what happens is we can easily create patterns in our life where we use guilt, and this guilt can just be overarching. A big thing I think I've used guilt for, and I still struggle with this, is judging my own feelings. Like, I think I was always taught that there was like bad feelings and good feelings, and the bad feelings were bad. And now I know that feelings are information. They're not necessarily good or bad, they're giving us information. But if I had the feeling of like envy or jealousy or something like that, or lust, then I would immediately go into guilt spin, I would call it. Just feel so bad and oh my goodness, what's wrong with me? Rather than now, I really work to be like, okay, I'm having envy. And then just be looking at it a little bit separately, like why am I having envy? What is it about this that's creating some envy? And it allows me to go into deeper things, because maybe the envy is related to like God has called me to have something and I don't, and I see something that I want, and that's okay. Or maybe I'm taking that too far and not being happy for them and for what God's given them. And so it just allows me to process things that are important to me. And so I can do that with like a lot of what I call negative feelings, but I automatically, when I have a negative, like quote unquote negative feeling, go into guilt. And so now I have to just step back and be like, oh, that was lust. Let's talk about this, Tara. And so it's very interesting how guilt can play a role as we judge our own emotions and feel guilty rather than just being like, oh, that was an emotion. What is that telling me? Let's do a little digging here. That's information. So pretty interesting. Or saying yes when we really want to say no. That really comes from a belief that we should be serving others and others' needs are more important than ours. And serving is great, but it shouldn't be at the expense of ourselves all the time. And if our guts and our body are saying no, we really need to listen to that and respect that. And that is a work in progress to always do that. So now I typically take a pause and be like, okay, I got to check in with myself. And I got to, just check in with myself and not just say yes. Because really, do I want someone to say yes to me when they don't really want to do it and their heart's not in it? I really don't. And so I try to be like, kind of do a little role reversal as far as that, to work through, my belief systems that are still kind of getting cleaned out of the closet and stuff like that. Another thing is what I call the shitty shoulds. I can definitely just should myself into doing things, and have been in the past. It's like, oh, I should do that, or I should be a good friend, or I should do that. But it's not coming from a heart of love as much as guilt. And I just don't really feel like that's where I want to be. And I don't think that really serves God. So I've, really kind of put a little alert in my head that if I'm using the word should to make me do something, then I really need to look at that a little bit closer, because that's just one of the shitty shoulds. Have you gone through a breakup that's kind of left you rattled and maybe questioning yourself some? Do you find that you're a pretty kind person that's chronically overgiving, overfunctioning, and maybe you're just plain tired and maybe a little resentful? Do you feel like you're going through the motions of life, but you're not really living your life? Well, that's what the Unravel Notebook is for. It's 61 days for you to create your life by intent and unravel your thoughts and beliefs so you can connect with God, yourself, and others in a better, more intentional way and live brighter. So boundaries has been probably the biggest change in my life, from being a kind girl to a recovering kind girl to a person that can really make room for themselves in the world and really appreciate everybody else doing that as well. And setting boundaries and learning what boundaries are has been huge for me. And they're really ways to basically kind of protect ourselves and own who we are. And that is something I want to do a whole big series on. And I have a special guest that I'm planning to have on. I'm very excited about. But boundaries are huge. I will say that when I first started setting boundaries, it was very painful for me because automatic guilt. And I will tell you, even now, I will have guilt about setting a boundary sometimes, and I just have to say, oh, that's guilt. Let's process that. Let's ask guilt, let's ask it. What is it saying to me? And if it's something I want to adopt, or if it's something I want to believe, or it's something I'm just like, oh, that's false guilt, and I'm just going to renounce that in the name of Jesus. But I struggle. So I have a rule when it comes to setting a boundary, and I always am very mindful when I'm setting boundaries and being like, have thought it out, planned it out, sorted it out through my, the BARF notebook process. And so just really setting a boundary and then not allowing myself to change it or anything for 24 hours. It's not even an option, because usually by the 24 hours that guilt has done its little thing, and it's a feeling that goes away. But it's very interesting that even now I can be very firm in what I want, and I could still struggle with guilt. And I think that's part of, my background in a kind girl, and I'm getting better and better 1% at a time. For example, I had a boundary with my husband, and I wouldn't call it a boundary. It was more like, hey, honey, you're home all the time now, which, with his job, that's just how it was for a while. And I didn't have any time to myself at the house. And that I could tell was really affecting my spirit. Thankfully, I have a wonderful husband that's very supportive of me trying to do the right things for myself. And so I just said, hey, I really need a few chunks of time in the week to actually be able to enjoy the house to myself. and not have anybody there, because that is just so healing for me and so great. Because for me, I'll tell you, when I'm in the house by myself, let me tell you what I do. First of all, I make a freaking mess. I love to cook my types of food, and I make a mess, and I don't clean it up, for a while. And I love to dance, I love to sing, I love to clean. I like to be able to just feel like I could do what I want. And I'm not thinking about, oh, what do the kids need? What does my husband need? And I can just really go into what is important to me. And then I just clean it all up. And it feels so refreshing to me. And I know we're all different as far as what we need and what's important to us, but that's something that really does rejuvenate me. And so I'd asked my husband for these 2 blocks of time, and he's great with it. And still, I will struggle, and I just know this. It's like, when it comes to that time, I'm going to want to justify. I may feel bad and be like, oh, it's okay. And I may have guilt. And that's okay. I can deal with that because it is so good for me. And if it's good for me, it's good for us. And it's good for the whole crew. But it's funny how I'll automatically be like, yeah, and I feel guilty because I made this boundary. And he's supportive, I'm supportive. It's great to do, and I just have to watch that little green guilt that comes up in me. So how do we change this? That's what I'm always about, is how do we change something like guilt and work with it? And I think first thing is to understand the auto belief systems that are driving the guilt. Are we believing that our boundaries are hurting people, or that our wants are small, or are we putting ourselves under perfectionism, and so we're feeling guilt a lot? So really trying to understand the auto beliefs and what's driving the guilt. So that's number 1. And then number 2, decide what you want to believe. What is important to you? What are your beliefs? I feel like my mom constantly wants to put her beliefs on me. For example, she has a belief system that if you're family, you should always be loved, accepted, treasured, and all of that. And I actually don't have that belief system. So, she'll have a sister come to town that I don't actually get along with well or anything. She's like, everyone needs to come over and this and that. And I'm like, I'm just not going to, and have a good time. And oh my goodness, that is just not in line with her belief system. And so she'll want to put that belief system on me, but I actually don't really believe that just because somebody is family, we should guilt ourselves or manipulate, ourselves into spending time with someone that we actually don't really get along with or don't really like at all. And so we just have a different belief system. So deciding what we want to believe, not what other people want us to believe, because they're happy to tell us what they want us to believe, but what is truly important to ourselves. And then number 3 is know ahead of time that you may have some false guilt, and that guilt may be a byproduct. And just know that that's probably going to be there, and have a plan. As far as okay, I'm probably going to feel guilty, and I'll just stick with that for 24 hours. And then I can just do some self-care, do what I need to do to process this guilt, journal, and that's okay. And then really just, again, analyzing it and being like, okay, could this guilt be a byproduct of some change that needs to happen? Does it go against the value of I'm wanting to please others all the time? Or what is it? But I really believe, in the Bible, it talks about how, Jesus came to set us free, but we have an enemy that wants to kill, steal, and destroy us. And I think he loves using guilt to do that, because what's going to make us feel small and not want to be who we're created to be? Oh, guilt. Guilt's great at that. It keeps us small and caged. And so that's something to really know, that is the enemy's plan for us, to keep us small and not be who the image of God that God created us to be, all unique and all different with different wants, needs, and desires. And so really being like, hey, I'm just going to say no to that, because that guilt is false guilt, and I just don't accept that. So, and then also, if you do have some false guilt, or guilt that you're like, oh, I got to process through that, we can give ourselves self-care and support, and we can just kind of separate this from it, put the guilt in the purse and being like, oh, that's guilt. And that's because I've, put myself out there, and this is what I want, and I'll just keep that in the purse there. And I can journal about it. I can rest. I can give myself comfort. stuff like that. And then the last thing is just seek some support. It's a lot easier for others to spot our false guilt and our belief systems that are kind of ridiculous than it is for us to see our own. And that's why it's nice to have like a friend, a life coach, a counselor, whatever we need to kind of help us see our own brains. To see like, yeah, you have a belief system that you are going to hurt someone by having to, just set this boundary. And that's actually not true. That's what you're thinking. And so it's very interesting to, how important it is to have others in our lives to show us about false guilt and different things like that. So yeah, to change, got to understand our auto beliefs, decide what we want to believe, know ahead of time that we may have some false guilt, analyze it, and be like, know that the enemy likes to use guilt to keep us small, and then give us some self-care and seek some support. So let's all grow 1% at a time, a little less guilt, more guilt-free, and just loving ourselves and loving God and loving others more. Make it a great day.